Spoštovani gostje, v dvorano prihaja predsednik Republike Slovenije, gospod Borut Pahor. K uvodnemu nagovoru vabim podpredsednika vlade in ministra za zunanje zadeve vlade Republike Slovenije, gospoda Karla Erjavca.
Hvala lepa. Spoštovani predsednik Republike, spoštovane gospe in gospodje, dobrodošli na današnji panelni razpravi namenjeni izmenjavi mnenj o EU globalni strategiji. Posebej bi rad pozdravil dr. Natalij Toči, posebno svetovalko visoke predstavnice Mogherini. Dr. Točijeva je s svojo ekipo pripeljala pripravo EU globalne strategije v zadnjo tretjino, za kar si zasluži naše odkrito priznanje. Zelo sem zadovoljen, ker je Slovenija aktivno sodelovala v tem procesu. Pomembno je, da smo skupaj z Inštitutom EU za varnostne študije ter vsemi državami članicami oblikovali kakovostno vsebinsko bazo za dokončanje strategije in za njeno politično potrditev predvidoma na junijskem zasedanju Evropskega sveta. Naše vsebinsko delo pri pripravi prispevkov za EU globalno strategijo je izhajalo iz procesa priprave dveh strateških dokumentov slovenske zunanje politike, sprejetih julija lani. Priprava deklaracije in strategije je bila dragocena izkušnja, saj je od nas zahtevala temeljit vsebinski premislek. Obenem se je izkazal velik pomen odprtosti postopka priprave ter široko zastavljenih posvetovanj, tako v strokovni kot v političnih krogih. Spoštovani, Slovenija je ves čas podpirala idejo o oblikovanju Evropske unije globalne strategije na področju zunanje in varnostne politike. Varnostna strategija EU, sprejeta leta 2003, nikakor ne omogoča ustreznega odziva na spremenjene izzive, s katerimi se soočamo v Evropski uniji, širši regiji ter celotni mednarodni skupnosti. V času našega vstopa v Evropsko unijo pred 11 leti sta mednarodne odnose zaznamovala odprtost in optimizem. Danes je poglavitna smer delovanja ponovno odločno zagovarjanje ozko definiranih nacionalnih interesov. Kriza v Ukrajini je razkrila razpoke v evropski varnostni politiki ter zamajala temelje ureditve oblikovane pred 40 leti s Helsinško sklepno listino. Opozorila nas je tudi na politično in gospodarsko krhkost postsovjetskega prostora. V zadnjih letih so se izjemno zaostrili varnostni izzivi na Bližnjem vzhodu, v Severni Afriki ter v širšem afriškem prostoru. Posledice teh izzivov so v različnih oblikah prizadele tudi Evropo. Iz gospodarske in finančne krize smo zdrsnili v varnostno krizo. Politična tranzicija v arabskem svetu ostaja nedokončana in nedorečena. Oboroženi spopadi, terorizem in nasilen ekstremizem, ki se najbolj jasno manifestira v pojavu Daeš, so izziv samemu konceptu države kot suverene in odgovorne članice mednarodne skupnosti. Gre za dolgoročne grožnje, ki bodo od drugih skrb vzbujajočih pojavih populizma in avtoritarnosti v Evropi in svetu zahtevale celovite odgovore. Potrebne bodo usklajene aktivnosti na varnostnem področju, na področju preprečevanja radikalizacije in ekstremizma, na področju medkulturnega dialoga. Vprašanje migracij v sredozemskem prostoru, ki jih poganjajo varnostne krize, pomankanje virov in odsotnost pozitivne perspektive za vse številčnejšo mlado populacijo, obstaja daleč od rešitve. Le-ta mora biti strateška, dolgoročna. Prav zaradi globalnih izzivov, s katerimi je soočena Evropska unija, potrebuje več odprtosti. Slovenija ostaja zagovornica širitve Evropske unije. To je najmočnejši geopolitični inštrument EU. Je vzvod za krepitev politične in gospodarske stabilnosti ter varnosti v širši evropski regiji. Vstop novih članic pomeni širitev območja skupnih vrednot. Kot država, ki je bila utemeljena prav na spoštovanju človekovih pravic ter temeljnih svoboščin in na prelomu z državo, ki tega ni bila sposobna zagotoviti, se Slovenija odločno zavzema za nadaljnji razvoj, uveljavljanje in varstvo človekovih pravic tudi v mednarodnem kontekstu. Zavedati se je potrebno, da so vsi izzivi, s katerimi se mednarodna skupnost danes srečuje, izjemno kompleksni in prepleteni. Za njihovo uspešno reševanje je zato potreben celosten pristop, ki mora v ospredje postaviti dobrobit posameznika. Nasloviti je potrebno razvojna in varnostna vprašanja ter vidik človekovih pravic, to pa pomeni, da se moramo posvetiti ključnim elementom človekove varnosti. Človekova varnost vsebinsko daleč presega vprašanja klasične nacionalne varnosti. Glavna grožnja že dolgo niso več oboroženi meddržavni spopadi. Sodobni varnostni izzivi so državljanske vojne, aktivnosti radikalnih skupin, pomankanje demokracije, vladavina prava, nespoštovanje človekovih pravic, nesposobnost držav, da svojim državljanom zagotovijo varno in dostojno življenje, posledice podnebnih sprememb, propadle države. Vse, kar sem pravkar naštel, so tudi temeljni vzroki migracijske krize, s katero se EU intenzivno sooča danes in s katero se bo soočala tudi v prihodnje. Begunci in ekonomski migranti, ki trkajo na naša vrata, so tu prav zato, ker v svojih domovinah ne najdejo fizične, materialne ali mišljenjske varnosti. Naslavljanje vzrokov migracij je tesno povezano s človekovo varnostjo. Območja, s katerih ljudje bežijo ali se izseljujejo, so različna. Vsem pa je skupno to, da se ljudje na njih počutijo ogroženo, negotovo ali brezperspektivno. In to so ključni izzivi, s katerimi se mora Evropska unija soočiti na globalnem odru. Na razpolago ima vrsto mehanizmov, od političnega dialoga do krepitve gospodarskega sodelovanja, od razvojnih projektov do izmenjave znanja in tehnologij. Pomembno je, kako bo Evropska unija izvajala cilje globalnega trajnostnega razvoja ter dogovore na področju podnebnih sprememb. Učinkovite, usklajene ter pravočasne aktivnosti na teh področjih bodo iz Evropske unije naredile resničnega globalnega akterja. Spoštovani gostje, najbrž ni nikogar v dvorani, ki se ne bi strinjal s tem, da je prav zdaj pravi čas, da Evropska unija kot celota ter vse države članice opravimo resen in strateški dolgoročni premislek. Migrantska kriza je izpostavila vse naše pomanjkljivosti, tako notranje kot zunanje komponente naše integracije. Zato je Vlada Republike Slovenije oblikovala pobudo, ki je omogočila boljše upravljanje migracij na balkanski poti. Aktualna migracijska kriza je odraz globih in obsežnejših procesov v mednarodni skupnosti. Zato v Evropski uniji potrebujemo dolgoročni razmislek o ustreznih rešitvah na te nove izzive. Zlasti pa potrebujemo utrditev evropskih vrednot in identitete, pri čemer izhajamo iz načel demokracije, spoštovanja človekovih pravic ter učinkovitega delovanja evropskih in nacionalnih institucij. To je nujen pogoj, da bo Evropska unija lahko dosegla in ohranila gospodarsko moč, globalno konkurenčnost, inovativnost ter globalno politično težo. Evropska unija je v edinstvenem položaju, da se lahko pogleda v ogledalo, prouči obstoječe aktivnosti, inštrumente in pristope, jih ovrednoti in odpravi pomanjkljivosti. Mislim, da je danes to naša primarna naloga. EU globalna strategija se mora osredotočiti na obstoječe koncepte in mehanizme skupne zunanje in varnostne politike. Izločiti je potrebno neučinkovite ter ukrepiti tiste, ki bi lahko delovale bolje. Vsem, ki ste sodelovali v vseh dosedanjih razpravah in ki boste s svojim vsebinskim prispevkom sodelovali tudi v tej razpravi, se iskreno zahvaljujem za sodelovanje. Prepričan sem, da bomo s predlogi in razmisleki, ki bodo nastali, lahko prispevali kar nekaj pomembnih elementov v procesu priprave EU globalne strategije. Hvala za vašo pozornost.
Hvala gospodu Karlu Erjavcu. Pozdravnemu nagovoru vabim vodjo predstavništva Evropske komisije v Republiki Sloveniji, dr. Zorana Stančiča.
Hvala lepa, spoštovani gospod predsednik, spoštovani ambasadorji, spoštovani podpredsednik vlade, poslanci in evropski poslanci, dame in gospodje. Dovolite mi, da vas tudi pozdravim v imenu Evropske komisije in se hkrati tudi zahvalim Centru za evropsko prihodnost za organizacijo tega pomembnega dogodka. Zelo pomembno je tudi sporočilo, da današnji popoldanski del dogodka je odprt za javnost, tako da pomembna diskusija o teh temah prihaja tudi v širšo zainteresirano javnost. Še zlasti pa je pomembno to, da nas bo danes nagovoril tudi predsednik Republike in s tem podal poseben pomen današnjemu dogodku. V vse bolj povezanem, konfliktnem in zapletenem svetu, ki se dinamično spreminja, je zelo pomembno usklajeno zunanje delovanje Evropske unije. EU potrebuje močno skupno zunanjo politiko kot učinkovit odgovor na globalne izzive, vključno seveda tudi s krizami v sosedstvu. Potrebujejo za spodbujanje lastnih vrednot in tudi za prispevek k blaginji in miru v svetu. Mir ne more in ne sme biti samoumeven. Kdo bi si mislil, da je mir večen in poglejmo, kaj se je dogajalo zgolj nekaj let nazaj, ko si nismo niti približno mislili, da je možna vojna v Evropi. Po dogodkih v Ukrajini, vključno s Krimom, nikomur več ni do smeha. Ko govorimo o Evropi, ne smemo pozabiti, zakaj so po drugi svetovni vojni evropske države odločile se, da ne bodo ponavljale velikih napak iz prejšnjega stoletja. Vojne, kot veste, so tudi glavni sprožilec begunske krize. Ne glede na zapisano v dokumentih Evropske unije je in mora biti danes najpomembnejša prednostna naloga EU reševanje begunske krize, vključno seveda tudi z razlogom za begunsko krizo. Dame in gospodje, Evropa je najbogatejša celina na svetu. Ima 500 milijonov prebivalstev, pa vendar že od začetka begunske krize govorimo, da ne bomo mogli sprejeti 1 ali 2 milijonov beguncev. Kaj si morajo drugi misliti o nas? Sami si kvarimo dobro ime. Ljudje po vsem svetu, ki so vedno gledali na Evropo z velikim upanjem, nenadoma ugotavljajo, da smo obtičali globoko v svojem lastnem egoizmu. Predolgo se nismo mogli dogovoriti za skupno evropsko rešitev za spopad z evropsko krizo. Na kocko smo postavili celo ključne evropske vrednote. Ob koncu stoletja bomo Evropejci predstavljali le 4% od 10 milijard svetovnega prebivalstva. To je relativno 5krat manj kot na začetku 20. stoletja. Postali bomo šibkejši namesto močnejši, če ne bomo razumeli, da sedaj ni čas za okope znotraj nacionalnih meja. Čas je torej za krepitev Evrope, če želimo čez 20 ali 30 let imeti določeno vlogo v svetu. Če želimo in če zmoremo, potem bodo ljudje prisluhnili Evropi. Pri najbolj perečih izzivih namreč lahko uspemo le kot Evropska unija. Vendar unija nista zgolj Bruselj in Strasbourg, Unija so evropske inštitucije, države članice, njihove nacionalne vlade in seveda parlamenti. Dovolj je, da spodleti enemu od nas in vsi bomo obtičali. Nihče od nas ne sme zanemariti seveda skrbi za ljudi. Zadnji rezultati evropske raziskave javnega mnenja kažejo, da državljane Evropske unije poleg priseljevanja oziroma razmer v zvezi z begunsko krizo najbolj skrbi tudi terorizem. Kar četrtina vprašanih namreč meni, da je terorizem najpomembnejša tema, s katero se trenutno sooča Evropska unija. Hkrati pa slaba polovica vprašanih v Sloveniji meni, da so dobro obveščeni v evropskih vprašanjih. Samo slaba polovica. Obenem pa 70% ljudi je odgovorilo na eurobarometrske raziskave, da si želijo o Evropski uniji izvedeti več. Zadnji podatek, dame in gospodje, je ohrabrujoč. Zanimanje za EU in za EU rešitve torej obstaja. Treba je samo najti način, kako javnost vključiti v razpravo, v premislek o tem, kaj si želimo v prihodnje in kako si predstavljamo globalno strategijo Evropske unije in tudi identiteto Evropske unije. Današnji dogodek zagotovo prispeva k več razprave in s pomočjo spletnega prenosa omogoča dostop tudi širši zainteresirani javnosti. Veselim se slišati vaše prispevke in nam vsem skupaj želim uspešen dogodek. Hvala lepa.
Hvala dr. Zoranu Stančiču. K osrednjemu govoru vabim predsednika Republike Slovenije, gospoda Boruta Pahorja.
Visoki gostje, ekscelence, dame in gospodje. V začetku decembra 2009 je stopila v veljavo Lizbonska pogodba. Lizbonska pogodba predstavlja institucionalni pravni okvir delovanja Evropske unije. Od tedaj se Evropska unija sooča z dvema krizama, finančno in migrantsko, če druge manjše odmislimo. Moja teza pa je, da se za finančno, migrantsko in drugimi krizami ter izzivi sooča slabše, kot bi se lahko, zato, ker je v krizi Evropska unija sama. Moje mnenje je, da smo se 25 let po velikih družbenih spremembah na starem kontinentu, 60 let po veliki imenitni ideji sprave in zametkov evropskega sodelovanja in povezovanja, potem, ko je kmalu po začetku novega 21. stoletja prišlo do neuspeha s pobudo za novo Evropsko ustavo in sprejetjem Lizbonske pogodbe kot pragmatično rešitvijo za nastal institucionalni deficit, znašli v situaciji, ko moramo temeljito, konceptualno odgovoriti na vprašanje, kako naprej. V nasprotnem primeru se nam bo, dame in gospodje, dogajalo, da se bomo, tako kot v primeru migrantske krize, tudi v primeru soočenja z drugimi izzivi sodobnega sveta, vedno znova znašli v položaju, ko bomo ugotovili, da nam institucionalni okvir Evropske unije na nek način sam po sebi v osnovi ne dopušča, da bi se do uspešnih rešitev dokopali prej ali uspešneje. Zato je moja teza, da potrebujemo drzno, premišljeno seveda, vendar drzno zamisel o nadaljevanju tiste poti, ki nas je pripeljala do sem, torej poti sodelovanja in povezovanja. Mogoče bom šel nekoliko izven okvirov moje protokolarne pristojnosti, ko bom za potrebe te konference z nekoliko intelektualne in človeške svobode dejal, da pomeni logično nadaljevanje poti, ki so jo zastavili ustanovni očetje Evropske skupnosti oziroma evropskih skupnosti in današnje Evropske unije, najprej na osnovi Pariške pogodbe in kasneje z Rimskim sporazumom ter drugimi, v bistvu zamisel Združenih držav Evrope. Tako osebno vidim perspektivo take Evropske unije, ki bi, ne da bi takoj, danes in v celoti imela podporo med skoraj 500 milijardo njenih prebivalcev, v bistvu zapolnili institucionalno vrzel, ki smo jo dolžni opaziti med problemi, s katerimi se soočamo, in rešitvami, ki jih nismo sposobni najti. Obstaja tudi druga, zame veliko manj privlačna pot in tista, za katero se lahko upravičeno zdi, da jo večina politik ta hip ubira. In to je, da se v odsotnosti institucionalnega okvira, ki bi omogočal, da bi tudi skupna zunanja in varnostna politika Evropske unije bila uspešnejša, predvsem pa, da bi bila najprej natančno določena, da bi uživala konsens, da bi konsens, ki bi ga imeli pristojni organi, imel potrebno pravno in politično moč, tudi instrumente za njegovo uveljavitev. To je seveda v nasprotju s tistim, čemur smo zdaj priča, rahljanju Evropske unije, rahljanju skupnih politik, neki eroziji enotnosti in sodelovanja, kar seveda v političnem smislu daje veliko manevrskega prostora tistim političnim silam, ki v vračanju nazaj k obsoletnim zamislim o moči suverenosti vidijo perspektivo za lastne interese in tudi uspevajo. V odsotnosti vizije, ki bi tej dala alternativo, uspevajo. Moje mnenje je, da je zdaj, ko se na prvi pogled zdi najmanj primeren trenutek, najbolj imeniten trenutek, da se vsi tisti, ki nam zamisel Evropske unije pomeni ne samo mir in ne samo varnost in ne samo blaginjo za nas in za rodove za nami, ampak še nekaj več od tega, da stopimo skupaj in da ne čez noč, ker to ni mogoče, ne v nekaj mesecih, ker tudi to ne zadostuje, ampak v nekaj letih, ob izrednem intelektualnem in političnem naporu, ponudimo alternativno vizijo razpadanja Evropske unije, ki jo mogoče zdaj hoče kdo še veliko bolj poantirati, kot ustreza samim dejstvom, in damo vizijo bolj enotne in bolj učinkovite Evrope, pa ne jo imenujemo Združene države Evrope ali damo temu projektu kakšno novo ime. Ampak zdaj je politično pravi čas. Če ga bomo zamudili, bomo lahko čez nekaj let ugotovili, da smo zamudili trenutek, v katerem smo na križišču zgodovine imeli tisti, ki verjamemo v skupno Evropo in v njen pomen za mir, svobodo, pa tudi za njen globalen vpliv v svetu, da smo zamudili trenutek, ko bi ljudem, ki se ozirajo za alternativami, ponudili tisto, v katero verjamemo, in smo zaradi ali nemoči, ali intelektualne nesposobnosti, ali zaradi ravnodušnosti pustili, da nam usoda in inercija prepusti ta zgodovinski tok tistim, ki vidijo preteklost v vrnitvi ki vidijo prihodnost v vrnitvi v preteklost. Zato izkoriščam to konferenco, ki se ukvarja zlasti in predvsem s problemom migracij, zato ključno kontekstualno opozorilo. Ne gre samo za to, da se zdaj v času migrantske krize osredotočimo na to, kako to migrantsko krizo rokovati bolj humano in bolj uspešno. Ker se moramo zavedati, da imamo institucionalne omejitve, ki nam omogočajo, da bi se do takega cilja dokopali. To seveda nas ta hip ne razrešuje odgovornosti, da seveda ta trud opravimo. In v tem smislu ta konferenca zelo potrebna in koristna. In jo tukaj v veliki dvorani predsedniške palače tudi osebno pozdravljam in gostim. Vendar se moramo zavedati omejitev, s katerimi se pri tem soočamo. Moja teza je, da reševanje sedanje begunske krize ni predvsem vprašanje politične volje, kot se skuša prevečkrat in napačno povedati, ampak je predvsem rezultat institucionalne krize Evropske unije same in dolgoročno lahko podobne krize Evropska unija uspešneje regulira samo, če bo bolj in ne manj povezana. Sedanji procesi, sedanji trendi pa kažejo na to, da v odsotnosti te vizije bolj povezane Evropske unije zmagujejo tiste politične sile, ki vidijo v eroziji Evropske unije rešitev za probleme. Ampak po mojem mnenju to ni rešitev za probleme, ampak je to v bistvu problem sam zase. Kar se tiče migrantske krize, nas seveda dejstvo, da v kratkem času ne moremo pričakovati hitrih institucionalnih rešitev, tudi če bi šle v smer, ki jo sam zagovarjam. Nas, kot rečeno, ne odrešuje odgovornosti, da iščemo humane, pragmatične in uspešne rešitve v realnem času. Naj poudarim, da sem vselej in tudi danes mnenja, da je tako imenovana begunska kriza najprej in predvsem humanitarno razsežnost in ne varnostno. Varnostno razsežnost, torej begunska kriza je tudi varnostna kriza, ne zato, ker je taka po svoji naravi, ampak zato, ker jo zaradi nesposobnosti Evropske unije, da jo rešuje kot humanitarno krizo, se ona izpeljuje tudi v varnostne dimenzije. Če drugega ne, nam to kaže na to, kako je narava kriz sama po sebi pravzaprav en znanilec potrebe po spremembi institucionalnih, pravnih in na koncu političnih pogojev za to, da bi Evropa veliko bolj enotno in uspešno naslavljala probleme teh kriz kot v sedanji situaciji. Naj zaključim. V času od sprejema oziroma uveljavitve Lizbonske pogodbe, torej od 1. decembra leta 2009, do danes se je Evropska unija soočila vsaj z dvema velikima krizama, finančno in begunsko. Osebno se spomnim neštevilnih sestankov Evropskega sveta, ko smo poskušali v bistvu brez pravih pravnih podlag reševati finančno krizo. Na koncu se je zdelo, da smo nekako s celo vrsto sui generis intervencij to krizo uspeli na ravni evroobmočja, na ravni Evropske unije rešiti, bolj ali manj. Vendar vam moram povedati, ne da bi bil ekspert za ekonomska vprašanja, da je ta požarni zid, kot mu radi rečemo, prenizek in premalo odporen, da bi evropsko ekonomijo, tudi tisto v območju evra, naredil za dovolj robustno za naslednjo krizo, ki bo slej ali prej prišla iz Wall Streeta. Kajti, finančna industrija ni regulirana tako, da nas bi obranila pred naslednjo krizo in zato jo je mogoče v naslednjih letih napovedati. V sistemu, v katerem imamo v območju z evrom eno centralno banko, in 18 fiskalnih politik, drugače tudi biti ne more. Ni tiste robustnosti, ki se lahko privoščijo recimo Združene države Amerike ali kakšna druga velika ekonomija na svetu, Evropska unija pa se tega ne more, ker ji tega ne dovoljujejo institucionalni pogoji. Vse drugo je zelo nevarno licitiranje diskrecijskih politik ali držav s fiskalnimi politikami ali pa Evropske centralne banke z ukrepi. Pri čemer imate države, ki evra sploh nimajo, in države, ki želijo izpogajati posebne pogoje za njihov obstoj v Evropski uniji. Begunska kriza ni samo vprašanje denarja, kot je bila najprej in predvsem finančna kriza, ampak je vprašanje ljudi. To ji daje tisto moralno razsežnost, ki je tisti presežek, zaradi katere je občutljiva v tako rekoč vseh razsežnostih. Naj ponovim moje mnenje. V bistvu je to humanitarna kriza. Čeprav gre seveda ne samo za vprašanje tistih ljudi, ki bežijo iz varnostno občutljivih območij, ampak tudi za ljudi, ki bežijo iz manj varnostno občutljivih območij zaradi želje po boljšem življenju. Ampak v osnovi gre za begunsko krizo in največ, kar bi lahko bilo poleg humanitarnega problema, bi lahko rekli, da je to logistični problem. Toda zaradi pomanjkljive, ustrezne institucionalne podlage Evropske unije, da ta problem rešuje kot humanitarni problem ali pa kot logistični problem, se je to sprevrglo tudi v varnostnega. In to je treba priznati. Da bi se v naslednjih letih ali desetletjih izognili podobnim situacijam, sem povedal, menim, da je potrebno spremeniti kontekst sam. To je pa institucionalna podlaga Evropske unije. Mi smemo in smo dolžni opaziti, da je Lizbonska pogodba prinesla kar opazne, krepke spremembe na področju skupne zunanje in varnostne politike. Nenazadnje smo dobili visoko predstavnico oziroma visokega predstavnika Evropske unije za skupno evropsko in varnostno politiko. Dobili smo cel sistem, tako rekoč cel diplomatski sistem in varnostni sistem, ki poskuša v bistvu odpraviti deficit, ki smo bili priča tako rekoč celo zgodovino starega kontinenta. In vendar lahko ugotavljamo, da danes ta sistem ni sposoben dovolj hitro in dovolj učinkovito pripeljati Evropske unije do take evropske zunanje in varnostne politike, ki bi imela učinke, ki si jih sicer večinoma želimo. Nismo sposobni dokončati reševanja ukrajinske krize, nismo sposobni intervenirati v bližnjo vzhodno krizo z neko jasno politiko in koncepcijo, imamo zelo različna stališča glede reševanja problemov držav na severu Afrike, da o drugih kriznih žariščih sploh ne govorimo, kjer se glas Evrope toliko manj sliši. Mi smo polmilijardna skupnost, skozi zgodovino smo si nabrali, mislim tukaj na 28 držav, dovolj izkušenj in znanja, da smo sposobni veliko več od tega, kar ta hip svetu in sebi zagotavljamo. Vendar pa nimamo pravih vzvodov, ki nam bi to omogočali. In zato se zdi napačno, deloma, da je reševanje begunske problematike zdaj vprašanje politične volje. Deloma je to res, prav gotovo. Deloma pa to ni res in to moramo prepoznati, drugače bomo tavali v slepi ulici pri tej in pri drugih krizah. V svojem prispevku, dame in gospodje, sem želel povedati, da so trenutki, ki se jih v zgodovini za velike ideje ne sme zamuditi. Zdaj je tak trenutek, ko se najmanj zdi, da je večina Evropejcev, pol milijarde nas je, pripravljena sprejeti zamisel bolj poglobljene in bolj povezane Evropske unije, zdaj je pravi čas, da tisti, ki v to verjamemo, z vsemi intelektualnimi in političnimi močmi, preko državnih mej in preko nacionalnih razmejitev, stopimo skupaj in to vizijo tej polmilijardni skupnosti ljudi tudi predstavimo. To bo najprej postavilo pod vprašaj tiste, po moje, za Evropsko unijo nevarne politike, ki vidijo našo prihodnost v poti nazaj, v poti v preteklost, kar bi, da kot gostitelj te konference, predsednik Republike Slovenije povem, eno majhno, 2-milijonsko državo na občutljivem geopolitičnem prostoru postavilo znova v položaj, ko bi se morala soočati s starimi geopolitičnimi problemi, za katere smo menili, da so preseženi prav za ustanovitvijo Evropske unije in našim vstopom vanjo. Zato je v najbolj neposrednem interesu države, ki jo predstavljam, da politične sile, ki vidijo v bolj povezani in bolj enotni Evropski uniji, nekako zdaj zaradi sramežljivosti, zaradi morda pomankanja odločnosti, zaradi tega, ker njihova vizija ni intelektualno popolnoma kristalna, ne popuščajo, ne odnehajo. Zdaj je pravi trenutek, želel sem izkoristiti to priložnost, da pojasnim, zakaj je to pomembno tudi za nastajajočo zunanjo in varnostno politiko. Mislim, da ima ta v okviru Lizbonske pogodbe svoje meje, da prav begunska kriza te meje tako zelo surovo kaže, da je čas, da postavimo nove, ki bodo na ravni izzivov 21. stoletja. Minister, visoki predstavnik komisije, sta omenjala nekatere druge probleme, ki so dejansko varnostne narave, kot je terorizem in drugi pojavi, za katere pa dejansko potrebujemo nekaj, kar bi lahko imenovali enotna, ne samo skupna varnostna politika. V želji, da bi dovolj hitro, kajti tukaj je pomembno tudi vprašanje časa, v želji, da bi dovolj hitro odgovorili na to vprašanje z odgovorom, ki bi ponudil varno in mirno Evropo, ne samo naši generaciji, ampak tudi generaciji naših otrok in vnukov, se vam lepo zahvaljujem za vašo pozornost in pozdravljam to konferenco ter ji želim uspešnega dela. Hvala.
Hvala predsedniku Republike Slovenije. V okviru informativnega posveta o globalni strategiji Evropske unije 2016 sledi panelna razprava Migracije in človekova varnost. Vljudno vabim paneliste, gospoda Rodrika Parksa, gospod Natali Toči, gospoda Jona Hojseterja, gospoda Martona Benedeka in gospoda Boštjana Videmška, da zasedejo svoje mesta za omizjem.
Righto, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second half of the event, and thank you for the kind invitation to be here today. Just as regards the format of the panel, let me prepare you in advance. We're going to hear very quickly from Natalie about how the European global strategy is relevant to the ongoing migration crisis. I'm then going to open up to discussion with our three panelists. We have John, who is the Deputy Director of UNHCR's regional office. We have Marton, who's been working for the European Commission, particularly on visa liberalization in the region, but increasingly on international security issues. And we have Boštjan, who's a journalist from the region, who's been following the refugee crisis closely here and in Turkey. Natalie, over to you. I think NATO has a saying when they're doing their grand strategies that a document can only influence the actions of states and societies if it's understood by the milkman in Omaha. Is that right? I'm not sure how many milkmen we have here, but try to explain to us how the global strategy would be relevant to this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Roderick. And let me begin, in fact, by thanking Slovenia. Thanking Slovenia for the participation so far in this process of producing a global strategy, from the points of national contact to the Foreign Affairs Council, all the way up. This has been really sort of fantastic input up until now, written input, oral input. This meeting here today, for which I thank in particular the President of Slovenia, the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. And I want to really emphasize the fact that the whole idea underlying the EU global strategy is really in the process. It is really the opportunity of having a conversation about Europe, which is not just a conversation in Brussels, it's a conversation that goes all the way to the national capitals, which is not limited to state institutions, not even to only national parliaments, but really aims at going well beyond that to civil society, to academia, to the think tank world, to the private sector. Depending obviously on the issue area, different sectors will be interested, all the way down to the milkman, indeed. Now, having made these first remarks, let me really focus, before moving on to migration and human security, on why we're doing this. Why is it that we're doing a global strategy? And I'm really going to try and relate to also some of the, I think, incredibly inspiring and important remarks that the President has just now made. Now, if I were to sum up the reason why we're doing this, I would come up with 3 words. The first is narrative, the second is direction, and the third is action. And let me perhaps just deliberate on what I mean here. Firstly, narrative. Indeed, and I think this was highlighted by the Foreign Minister, by the President, when we think about the European Union today, we think about crisis. We think about the Eurozone crisis, we think about the refugee crisis, we think about the divisions over Russia, we think about Grexit, we think about Brexit. We're not in very good shape. I don't think I need to remind anyone of this fact. And the whole point of the global strategy is really the idea of saying, hey, can we actually agree on something? Can we agree on something which is meaningful, which is substantive? Perhaps in Ljubljana, in Berlin, in Paris, it may be written in a slightly different way, but can we broadly agree on a common narrative, which is a shared narrative on which we can be united? And I must say that we're nearing the finishing line of this process. We're supposed to present the EU global strategy to the European Council at the end of June. And I must say that I am feeling fairly confident that we can actually agree on an important narrative together. As I said, the shades may be different in different countries, but on a whole, there is a shared sense of what we want to do and what we want to achieve. And that in and of itself is an important message to our citizens. The second point is direction. Indeed, because of all of these crises that surround us, we tend to be inevitably reactive. We jump from one crisis to the other. Now, this is part of politics. This is the way things work. And yet, if that's the only thing we do, if we simply jump from one crisis to the other, we will not have any sense of direction. The general idea of the global strategy is precisely that of providing that overall sense of direction. Now, is this going to change what we do tomorrow? What the European Council is going to decide next time? No, it probably won't. But can it help to provide that general sense of direction of where we should be moving together in the next 4, 5, 6, 7 years? Yes, that is what I think the main idea of the strategy should be all about. And thirdly, action. If we were to just come up with a nice story, particularly in these times of crisis, it would simply not be good enough. That may have been a sufficient rationale underpinning the first strategy that the European Union came up with in 2003, the European Security Strategy. That was an important moment to try and reconcile Europe, and at the time, the 15 after the war in Iraq. Today, that's not enough. Yes, we need to have that common narrative, we need to have that common sense of direction, but it actually also needs to change a bit about what we actually do. Which are the areas where we need to invest more in? Where are more resources needed? How can institutions change the way in which they act and, above all, act together? How to create greater coherence in the way in which we act? And how do we change our methods of working? Precisely because we're jumping from one crisis to the other, how to build into our mechanisms, our policies, our instruments, flexibility, the ability to respond more rapidly, to be more agile, and it will mean different things in different policy areas. It will mean different things in diplomacy as it does in development. And yet, that flexibility, that agility, that ability to respond and to understand the actual dynamics going on the ground is of fundamental importance. So narrative, direction, and action. And this brings me to today, and the migration crisis, human security, and the topic of today's discussion. I think on a whole, and this is really the reason why we have decided to call this a global strategy, and therefore not just a security strategy, the idea is really that of pulling together the different instruments and policies and institutions and players across the European Union. Human security is a wonderful concept, and it really allows us to do this. Human security is, yes, about security, and yet it is looking at the individual level, more broadly then at the community level. And once you go at that individual level, it is quite clear that you don't only need security and defense instruments, but you need a whole range of instruments from the humanitarian to the development, to the trade, to the energy, to the climate policies, etc. And it's really by bringing all of this together, and human security is really a concept that allows us to capture all of this. And let me perhaps just end, and this can then be a lead into this discussion, by highlighting the way in which human security really permeates already the work that we're undertaking under the global strategy. Now, this is a strategy that really aims, and it begins by outlining how important it is for the European Union itself to be stronger. And in order to be stronger, there are a number of things that we have to do, some of which, not all of which, but some of which have precisely to do with the area of refugees and migration. Yes, we need a stronger external migration policy to target, in particular, transit and origin countries. Yes, we need a stronger common external border policy, but we also need to do our internal homework. And our internal homework has to do with legal channels, it has to do with a common asylum system, it has to do with a common and single determination status. We need to get all of those bits in place if we want to be able to manage this crisis, and not only today's crisis, but tomorrow's crisis as well. Secondly, another big priority of the strategy is that of resilience. How to build the resilience of the states and societies that are in our surrounding regions, notably to the south and to the east. And we deliberately use the word state and society because the big point to be made here is that for states to be resilient, it is not just state institutions that we have to target. A resilient state requires a resilient society, and a resilient society has to do with the societal dimension, with the economic dimension, with the political dimension, with climate and energy, with a host of other things as well. Third priority and human security has to do with conflicts. Resilience is all very well and good when you do have states. But what happens when those states have collapsed, when they have imploded? What do we do about the Syria, about the Libya, about the Somalias, God forbid, about other countries in future? And here is where human security comes back in. In order to act in these conflicts, we cannot just act at the state level. We have to act much more at the local level as well. We have to, and this leads us to rethink a number of policy areas. It leads us to rethink peacekeeping policies. It leads us to think and rethink sanctions policies. How do we support legitimate forms of livelihood? How do we foster spaces of security, even in the most acute cases of conflicts and violence? Human security can be a concept that allows us to do this. And then finally, we need to broaden out. The final priorities of the strategy have to do with regional orders to our east, to our south, to our north, to our west. But particularly when we think about our east and our south, human security are fundamental concepts. Think about relations with Africa. How do we foster a regional order in Africa and the Middle East and the interconnections between the two, in which it is much more also the trans-regional dynamics that we have to look into. And again, human security can be a concept that can help us move in this direction. And then finally, the global level. Again, and this was, I think, a point that was being raised when talking about relative numbers. If you look at the broader global scene, the numbers, when we look at the migration crisis in Europe, are actually minuscule. There is a big story out there, which has not actually got to do that much with movements from the south to the north, but are much more horizontal movements between and across east and west. So this is a global phenomenon, and it's a global phenomenon that is going to be with us throughout the 21st century. And yet we don't really have effective global governance mechanisms to deal with this crisis. What can the European Union do, and what can it contribute in order to establish those governance mechanisms at the global level? And of course, in order to contribute meaningfully at that global level, again, we have to do our homework inside. If we want to lead by example, we've got to get it right inside in order to make a broader contribution to the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Let me get first reactions from our panelists. A question, the same question to each of you. Would a European global strategy, let alone one along the lines that Natalie talked about, have made any difference to the management of the migration crisis from your perspective? John?
First of all, thank you for inviting UNHCR to be part of this important discussion. Well, you're asking a broad question. I think, first of all, I want to say that it's very encouraging to hear the description of a global strategy, the way we just heard it, with a very much of an not a Eurocentric approach, but with a very strong awareness of what is the global situation. And I think a global strategy that takes into account and that fully understands that more than 86% of the world's, or around 85% of the world's refugee population is not in Europe, and that in fact most refugees are not on the way to Europe, any strategy that has that understanding at its basis will have a bigger chance to succeed. So I think that's a very important starting point. Also, as part of the same picture, I want to pick up also on the title for this event, and we've just heard elaboration on the concept of human security, which entails so much and so many important issues to address. But I want to pick up on the other word from this, migration and human security. And I want to mention a word of caution here, because migration opens up for an understanding that might not be fully reflecting of the reality. The President very eloquently mentioned this earlier. We are really speaking about what is very clearly a refugee situation, what is very clearly a situation that needs to have a humanitarian and a legal response. And what we've seen so far this year, I'm not speaking about last year even, this year is that 86% of the people who have crossed by sea to enter Europe are from the main refugee-producing countries in the world, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq. We need to make sure that our language doesn't hide that reality, and that our language does not get in the way of taking the right policy decisions about how to respond to this. No, not everyone who comes are refugees. Yes, there has to be a mix of policies to address that situation, but we need to have the core of the response to address what it is, a refugee problem. Perhaps also a word to end this round from my side. Another encouraging element of this introduction we just heard from Natalie was, I think the root causes needs to be highest on everybody's agenda, including from the EU. We can talk about responses and tools, and we can talk about initiatives and multi-year plans, but we need to engage as an international community with root causes. As long as people are fleeing for their lives from Syria, as long as people are fleeing for their lives from other conflicts and other persecution situations, we will not find sustainable solutions. I think I'll leave it to that for now.
Thank you, Martin.
Thanks very much to all the speakers, and thanks very much for having invited the Commission as well to this event in Ljubljana. I'd like to actually pick up on some of the points that Natalie made, to go back to Roderick, your point about whether a global strategy would have made any difference in our current handling of the refugee crisis. I think it would have made a difference, but given that we hadn't had one, we're going to have to look at ways of developing one for the future that I think might provide some sense of direction in which Europe wishes to head in the coming 5 to 7 years. So I think the first issue from a European perspective is, and I'm trying to be politically realistic, is how to manage the flows. Whether it's comparable to what we're seeing in Turkey, whether it's comparable to what we're seeing in Jordan, Lebanon, it is a political fact that large-scale migratory movements have an impact on domestic populations, host communities, and political preferences. So I think one of the political realities that we're facing today is that there are some political actors who wish to capitalize on some of these phenomena. So I think Europe together will have to come up with a way of managing flows, and there are a number of instruments that could come into the picture. Let me just highlight a few of those. First one is border management. The Commission has a new proposal to come up with a European border and coast guard, which to a large extent, to reflect the President's inspirational words, seeks to, in a way, federalize some of the policy responsibilities that are clearly not working at the level of member states. So the question is to what extent Frontex could have a more serious role in protecting our external borders. But I'll go beyond it. Our proposals which haven't even come out on how to reform the asylum system, how to reform Dublin, is essentially driven by the same logic. Is it sufficient to have a combination of 28 different patches of asylum systems with a number of core standards, or do we have to make a quantum leap of integration in, as Natalie said, the determination of refugee status, or some sort of federal policy solution? Again, this might be a different or dangerous word to use in some member states, but hopefully not in Slovenia. So the idea would be to really try and see whether there's more that we can do in terms of asylum and determination of refugee status at the European level. I'll go on to my second point, which is essentially how we can change the current migration flows from irregular flows to legal flows. And I think this is something of core interest to UNHCR, but also to many of our member states. Essentially what we've been facing so far is large groups of people, desperate people fleeing conflict and persecution back home, making that journey through human smuggling rings, incredibly dangerous dinghies to cross the seas to arrive in Greece. I happened to visit one of these transit centers in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia last week. They have really compelling personal stories, and they're fleeing conflict, and they decide to strike out on a journey which, from our legal perspective, is considered irregular, or some would say illegal. So I think the challenge would be to make sure that people who are genuinely fleeing conflict can find legal avenues to come to the European Union. And of course, if you look at the recent Turkish deal, resettlement is a primary example. People should be resettled from either camps or, mainly camps in the neighboring regions, so be that Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon. And we need European member states to make those pledges to resettle numbers of people who are fleeing conflicts, whether it's Syria or other places in the region. And of course, this is easier said than done. I mean, to make sure that this happens will require a lot of work from different member states. I'll give you another example which came up in the discussion this morning, is legal channels of basically employing potentially employing or opening our labor markets to third country nationals. And so far, the European Commission has the so-called Blue Cards Directive. But again, it's not matched to the situation right now. I mean, the Blue Card Directive is essentially about highly qualified IT engineers and doctors. And often, the people that we're facing in a refugee crisis of this magnitude are very different. They don't have the skill sets to be able to compete in European labor markets. So we need to think about the health policies, the educational policies, the training that might be necessary to actually integrate large groups of people who are considered genuine refugees by member states. And finally, a third point on how we can work with our partners. I think one of the things that we will need to think about, and this is based on my personal experience of working very, very closely with the Western Balkan states, is that we need to think of the incentives, the appropriate incentives to make sure that we collectively face this challenge. So that applies to border management, that applies to support. We have provided a lot of support to many of the countries on the Western Balkan route, but it goes beyond it. I mean, some people have mentioned visa liberalization, which doesn't come into the picture from a strictly Western Balkan perspective, but it's a major part of the story when it comes to Turkey. One of the main incentives that we were able to offer to Turkey was visa-free status by the end of June. So I think if we can think of creative ways in which to incentivize our core partners, I think that might be the way forward. Thank you.
Well, if we are talking about the human security priorities, there should be only one. It's saving lives and ensuring safe passage. And what we see right now and what the last deal has achieved, it's quite opposite in my opinion. This will not save lives. At least 24,000 refugees, at least 24,000 people, the language is very important, I completely agree, have died in the Mediterranean on their way to European Union in the last 16 years. 4,000 people died in last year. Mare Nostrum, the Mediterranean, is a mass grave. And we are witnesses to the crime against humanity. Europe as such, including its institutions and several national governments, is involved in this crime and partially responsible for one of the biggest human tragedies of our time. There was more than enough time to prepare a humanitarian and a humane solution and open a safe corridor and a passage. But the EU and her eyes were wide shut. The EU was impotent, in my opinion. There was no solution. Even worse, Europe started closing its borders from the outside and also from the inside. At the same time, European Union struck a deal with Turkey. European politicians made a deal on a bazaar of human tragedy and essentially sold the destiny of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people to the authoritarian regime in Ankara, which is waging a war against Kurds in their own country, closing down the independent newspapers and imprisoning activists and opposition politicians. On the other hand, there are more Syrian refugees in Istanbul and its surroundings than in the European Union at this moment. In Lebanon, where there were a bit more than 4 million people before the Syrian war, there is more than 1.2 million Syrian refugees right now. What I want to say is, there is no refugee crisis in Europe, not at all. There is a crisis of European Union, the crisis of Europe, the crisis of values, the crisis of humanism. The lack of positive European response and the dictatorships of small nationalisms and populisms has created a breeding ground for extreme right, and let's be honest, also for neo-Nazism. Europeans screams while refugees are suffering. This is an utter disgrace, and history will be our judge. This is all what I have to say.
Righto, thank you. I think we all hear the critical words. What I'm going to try to do in a sort of second round now is steer us a little bit towards constructive solutions if we can, and to work out where we can build on these in the strategy. So let me sort of ask you all two questions, and then I will open the floor to broader questions, so please prepare. The first question I would like to ask is, do we know enough about the people who are coming? It's been said that the world has a very workable relocation and resettlement system. It just happens to be run by the people smugglers. The difference between governments and people smugglers is that people smugglers understand their clients. Do we understand well enough the people who are coming here, what their aspirations are, what their strategies are, to be able to offer the kind of legal channels which, in one way or another, all four of you have talked about? So that's my first question. who are these people, and do we understand them well enough? The second question was really, I suppose the whole point of a human security approach is that we're looking at these issues from a bottom-up perspective. We're looking at new partners, we're looking at new alliances, new ways of dealing with these issues, ways that are not so sort of top-down and government-led. So I wanted to press you secondly on some of the dilemmas that you've faced in the field, also you in your journalistic capacity, new dilemmas that you faced, and new ways that you've come across to deal with those, new ways of working with people, things that you didn't expect would be helpful. Let's start again with John, if I may, and as I say, then I'll open the floor.
As you say, who do we know enough? Who is it that is coming to Europe? As I said earlier, we do know quite a bit about the profile. We know quite a bit about which origin people have. We obviously know quite a bit about the demographic composition. We know, for instance, that while last year there was a high percentage of young males arriving in Europe, we're seeing this year that there's a shift towards more children and more women arriving. But I think we can safely say that there's definitely more to be understood about what drives people's movements, and I'm not so much then talking about perhaps their move from their situation they fled from. It's pretty evident when you look at what's happening in Syria today. But perhaps what are the further drivers that, for instance, make someone take a decision to get on a boat in Turkey, or what makes someone, give someone an idea that there is a particular destination they have in mind, etc., etc. I think that one of the things that we would have liked to see from UNHCR, that we succeed better this year than last year, is how do we engage with refugees themselves on this issue? How do we consult with people who are on the move? How do we make sure that the policy responses we're working on are informed directly by the people who are meant to benefit from those interventions, and that we find good methodologies to bring them in to making those assessments and to shaping those policies. UNHCR has done a lot of work around the world on this in terms of developing tools, of having a participatory approach, having a situation where we develop our response together with refugees. But there is a problem. Many of those tools take as a starting point that there is a static situation, that we work in a camp environment, or that we are receiving people crossing from a situation of danger to safety. What we're talking about today is often a very fluid situation, and we saw at the extreme part of this last year, where in many points along the route, including in this country, we interacted maybe for 2 or 3 hours with people as they were moving. This gives a very small window of opportunity to actually engage with people on the route. It gives a very limited possibility to get information, but also to give information in a credible way. And I think that is part of the challenge in terms of managing mixed migration situations. There's also, of course, now an opportunity. What's happening in Greece at the moment is very, very difficult. The conditions in Greece, make no mistake, are very, very challenging on the ground. However, given that the situation is not as fluid as it was, we have an opportunity now to engage with people in a different way. And I think we need to look at the same in Turkey. How can we engage with the populations who are potentially going to go on the move? You mentioned it yourself. Basically, what we have to look at is how do we compete with smugglers? Let's be honest, smugglers have been extremely successful in identifying solutions and implementing them. We need to be better than them, and we need to put them out of business. And it's also been mentioned, Martin put it first forward, legal channels will have to be a major part of the solution. Fences can only go so far. Fences can influence perhaps a decision of whether to go this route or that route. But unless there are legal channels, we will be maintaining a market which will be extremely lucrative for smugglers, and which will be a high risk for people who are in need of protection. I wanted to mention on this an example of an attempt that UNHCR is making to think new about how do we communicate with refugees and how do we share that information. And I'll mention to you a website, tellingtherealstory.org. It is basically a platform that UNHCR has created where refugees from certain countries, because this is a pilot, refugees from certain countries are given a space to tell the story from their perspective, to basically show from their perspective why they left, what happened on the way, and what challenges have they found, for instance, arriving in Europe. The idea is to try and give this debate to some extent back to the people who are actually in the middle of it, as opposed to us speaking on their behalf. Are we there yet? No. We're not even near, but we need to do more of this type of thing. I encourage you to have a look at it because it really it has a human-centered approach and it puts people in the center of communicating about their own situation.
Thank you. Back to your question, do we know who these people are? And have I seen any encouraging forms of cooperation? The first question, I had an opportunity to visit the transit center in Tabanovce last week, which is the main transit center between the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia and Serbia. And something like 1,450 people have been stranded there, some for more than a month. So for me, this was really important that, I've been working on these issues for several months, but to actually talk to people who are affected by the decisions that, political leaders make in Europe. And I was literally blown away by the level of awareness they had of European politics, much more so than our citizens, I would venture to say, because for them, it was of core importance what the European Council would decide on Friday. They actually called it D-Day, which to me was a bit of a surprise. They called it D-Day in reference to the landing in Normandy in 1944. And of course, they wanted to know whether there was any possibility of Serbia opening the border. So I tried to explain to them that the probability of that was very, very low. Then I tried to ask them why they wouldn't apply for asylum where they were, and they said that their intention remained going to Germany, and nothing could deter them from that objective. Then they asked me what they should do instead. Should they pay for a human smuggler to smuggle them out of the camp? I said, that's not a good strategy, because in that case, you would still be caught for irregular border crossing at some point, and you would still end up in a camp, and you would still be stranded in another country along the route. So I said, why don't you go back to Greece, which is where basically most of these people came from, and I spoke to Afghans, Iraqis, and Syrians. And if you have a genuine story of persecution back home, you could enter the relocation program, and you could be relocated to one of our member states. This is basically what we're trying to put in place at the level of European institutions. And they said, look, is there a risk that we would be sent back to Turkey? And I said, well, there is such a risk, because if your story is not genuine, that you could be sent back to Turkey. And they said, look, in that case, it's best for us to stay, and we will wait for the Serbs to open the border. I mean, this is just a genuine story, but I mean, that shows you how rational they are about their options. And we really need to think of mechanisms that work on the ground, that eliminate the business of human smugglers, which is easier said than done, and creating legal avenues for people to actually make that rational calculation that it makes more sense to apply for legal resettlement in Europe than to go on this journey. And by the way, just a word about cooperation in that camp. I was really impressed how the local authorities worked with UNHCR, the Red Cross, even Médecins Sans Frontières had a large presence there. They had multilingual activists who spoke not just Arabic, but I think some of the signs were in Farsi and Pashtun. So I mean, it was obvious that a lot of thinking had gone into how to make conditions sustainable in that particular transit center.
Well, it's a rather simple question and also kind of orientalistic to ask who these people are. It's basically us in a different geographical, political, and security environment. It's us. I mean, And the answer is rather straight, because I spent last years, many years, following refugees everywhere, visiting war zones and basically visiting their own mahalas in their own cities and meeting them back here in Europe, coming to save their lives. And what I can say, it's, you know, this could easily happen to me in 1991. This could easily happen to people who are sitting here if the consequences of our, let's say, political decisions in 1999 were different, 1991 were different. So distinction between us and them, it's the root of all problems we've seen, and it really hurts me personally as a human being just to be in the position to define who the other is. There is no other, it's only us, it's only me. Or even better, there is no me, it's only us. This is all I have to say about who these people are. But let's go now in the very concrete description what has happened on the ground in the last couple of months. During last spring and early summer, the social and also demographical structure of refugees on the ground was completely different than it is now. At that time, let's say, middle class and also some members of upper Syrian, very strong upper middle class were fleeing, and they were fleeing the urban areas, the cities, Aleppo, Damascus, Homs, Hama, Dera, and etc. But in the last couple of months, things have drastically changed. People who were fleeing last year were using more safe and more secure and logistically easier ways to travel to Europe. And the reason why there were more men on the road was that they were preparing the reunion with the family. They were waiting, they left their children, they left their wives in their more or less endangered villages, and they were trusting Europe that the passage will stay open. But that has collapsed. And in the last couple of months, especially weeks, there was a big panic from Aleppo and in Aleppo and other cities, and women and children start fleeing, not just to reunite with their men, it was basically to save their lives. And on the other hand, not only the, the gender level have changed, the social structure has changed rapidly. More and more people who cannot afford to pay smugglers are fleeing, and they're endangered in their own country when they're already leaving their cities. And at this moment I would like to say that we must not forget at least 11 million people who are displaced inside of Syria and cannot afford to run away. Being a refugee as a Syrian right now is, do I dare to say that, a privilege.
Thank you. I'm going to open the floor now. Natalie, I know, has to leave at 4 o'clock, so I'm going to try to fit a quick round in. We've got a lot of open ends, I think, from that panel, and 3 beginnings of a constructive approach, but I slightly throw it to you, how we can sort of build on these dilemmas that were mentioned. Would somebody like to ask a question?
Representative, and if you don't mind, if you accept, I would like to answer your question put forward for the panel. Who are these people? Do we know enough about them? So my question to the UNHCR representative, do you think that UNHCR is also facing a crisis, institutional crisis, like financial crisis? And for example, the resettlement option is very limited for refugees right now, like less than 2%. And for example, there are so many urban refugees, which is a different issue in many parts of the world. And there are so many IDPs, internal displaced people also. And what do you think about the restructuring of a UNHCR, and in order to find out an answer to this global security strategy or global strategy of European Union? And plus about who are these people? I think we know a little bit about the profile and the demographics, where they come from, etc. about these people, but what we cannot understand totally, what what we cannot make sense is that these people, why do they risk their lives in order to come to Europe? After all, these people, I mean, European Union has become the most dangerous place, it seems, to enter. Like last year alone, 5,000 people lost their lives in the Mediterranean route. And so that's it. Thank you.
I forgot to ask, don't give the microphone away quickly. Say who you are. I forgot to say.
My name is Şebnem Akçapar. I'm an associate professor at Koç University in Istanbul. I'm a sociologist and I work on forced migration issues. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there was a hand over here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Tobias Flessenkämper, European Institute, Centre International de Formation Européenne. Actually, I wanted to start my little intervention with a question, actually. What has all of this made with us? Because what Natalia and her team is working on the strategy, I mean, there's a lot of things we have been discussing in the European Union. If you look at the 1999 temporary European Council on foreign and security policy, on also the link to the justice and home affairs sector and the asylum policy. If you look even further back to the internal, external security strategy in the 1992 Edinburgh European Council, basically at the time when that our colleague mentioned so eloquently. What is the difference with these documents and our current discussion is that they started with a very rights-based approach, a very norms-based approach of, defending human rights and humanitarian law and also becoming a player in humanitarian law. And this is a bit of what I feel missing in where is the global role of the European Union in becoming a leader in rights and humanitarian law and also, living up to the standards that have been developed here. And so this links me to my question, how much time have we got left to find a global strategy as much as a temporary strategy to deal with what I would like to call border and migration policy crisis, when we had actually so much work been invested both on the internal and external security agenda for the last 17, 18, 19, 20 years with so little result in terms of a coherent policy.
I think there was one more hand over here. Did another hand go up? Ah, okay, here please.
Is it work? Yeah. Vojislav Stojanovski, Macedonian Helsinki Committee. We are present daily at both border crossings, Macedonia-Greek border and Serbian-Macedonian border. Whenever there was a problem with a backlog, with a temporary blockade of the border, people would start, journalists, volunteers, would start asking us who's to blame, what's happening, why are the people not transiting anymore. Then we would ask our colleagues in Serbia, they would say it's a decision, it's a Croatian decision. Then we would ask our colleagues in Croatia, then they would say Slovenia made this decision, that is the reason why. We never realized or found out whether these decisions were unilateral by Slovenia or came from the EU itself. So my question would be, in this global strategy that you are discussing, do you have any body in mind that would transfer decisions, messages, that would have contact points in each of the countries so that we don't wonder who makes the decision and so that people don't think that there's a secretive body within the EU that makes the decisions? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll save your questions for a second round. As I say, Natalie needs to leave at 4, so I'm going to give her the word just to try to tell us what she's drawn from this discussion and then give it back to the panelists and then we'll have a quick second round.
Okay, let me just make three remarks. I mean, on the last question, of course, the global strategy is not the place in which one can take detailed decisions on problem X, Y, and Z. I mean, this is about the broad sense of direction. But there is an issue, and I would capture it in the word coherence, which really underpins all this. The whole purpose of this exercise is really to make sure that through a process that precedes it, and most importantly, the process that comes after a global strategy is adopted, there is indeed greater coherence between member states and across institutions. Because, of course, a lot of, in a sense, the blame game, if I can put it very bluntly, has to do precisely with those inconsistencies and those different forms of incoherence which exist at the moment, which makes the blame game possible. Second remark has to do with, I would connect the point that was being made about sort of the legal channels and the story about the Serbian-Macedonian, the camp on the Serbian-Macedonian border with the who are these questions? They are us. And this, if I were to put myself in the shoes of one of the people, and the person that you spoke to, indeed, I wouldn't move either. And I think to myself, when is it that I would move if I would move? I would move and I would go back to Turkey if I were actually, the minute in which I had the proof that there were real numbers, not 2, 3, 4,000, 100, 200, 300,000 numbers coming legally from Turkey into the European Union. That is when maybe I would move from the Serbian-Macedonian border, not before. And this really goes, I think, to the heart of the discussion that we're having here. If we want to, and I think this is the point that you were mentioning as well, if we want to get over the irregular, well, we have to create the regular. There's no other way. There's no other way. And then I would link this to the whole issue of the values. One of the main discussions that we had right at the beginning of this process was on this whole balance between the values and the interest and the values. And I personally at times find it a very sterile conversation. Often I think misinterpreted as being sort of hard-nosed in realpolitik because I talk about interests. And I don't want to have that value conversation. And actually, it's precisely the opposite, meaning before we start preaching to the world what they have to do, before we start telling people what they have to do, let's perhaps just put our own house in order. Let's get our own values straight inside. And then perhaps we're on more solid ground to actually go about the world spreading democracy or what have you. And I think this is really the moment that we're living in now. It's the values that underpin our own democratic systems that have been put to test. And the way in which we're responding to this, well, exactly, the rest of the world looks at us, and it hasn't been great, has it? So I think, and this goes to the broader global question that you were answering. I think the only way in which we can have an impact is by leading by example. But in order to lead by example, we've got to do our own internal work at home. And I think beginning with the EU-Turkey deal, why is it that we have limited leverage on Turkey? Why is it, this has been the way in which the story